So it's our opportunity to just give some introductory remarks about, I think, why voice and silence matters to John and I, and why we have written extensively about it and produced this new book. And I was aware of the irony of David saying that the great Unheard had joined the great Unread, but that's a case. If I go around my bookshelves, there are numerous books where I think, did I read that, or did I just see it reviewed and think, oh, that would be brilliant? So we're probably all slightly guilty of that. Okay, so I just wanted to share a story. A while back, before the book appeared, I was in conversation with somebody involved in management consulting, working for one of the big professional services companies. He was interested in the conversation to discuss the significance of voice and silence to his particular area of work, because in principle, his observation was that listening was crucial to the work he sought to do, looking to make sense of the circumstances in which he found himself in corporate settings where following through a project on behalf of his company. So he understood the significance of listening, as perhaps we might say so many leaders do these days. But I'll hold that thought to bring back in just a moment. His observations about his perspective as a consultant chimed quite interestingly some of the research that John and I had done in terms of the book. So we managed to attract 35 people who shared with us free text details of practical experiences of voice and silence. And one of those individuals very candidly said, it's really obvious in my workplace that the voice of the consultant or the contractor or something just coming in is deemed to be of greater value than the voice of me or any other person working in the organization. And that really resonated as I talked to this consultant, thinking, your voice has a greater weight in that setting, and perhaps the other voices around you that you're trying to listen to. He thought, the consultant also thought, there was a kind of tension at the heart of his work, which I think is probably correct. He talked about being expected to do this listening activity. So, I part of my job, I'm meant to listen to people. But at the same time, he was meant to be a fixer. He was meant to come in with solutions, come in with techniques or checklists or ways of getting stuff done, produce a big thick slide deck and say, this is how you fix your problem. This underscores for John and I something we picked up on in our previous book, which was called Leadership Unraveled, which is there's a generalized failure to attend to the headwaters of management thinking. We need to go further upstream to take into account what are the philosophical underpinnings that actually limit the capacity for thought and action amongst leaders in corporate settings. In that book, we highlighted a number of organizational paradoxes. We came to the conclusion they weren't actually philosophically paradoxes. They were actually areas of quite bad corporate practice that had a kind of ideological wrapping around them. So that's explored in some detail in terms of 5 paradoxes in particular. And then we had a look at a number of what we considered to be myths that really quite constrain people's practical thinking, and particularly leadership's thinking. First amongst the 6 myths that we teased out was the idea that all is fixable, and that really does exist at a social level as well as an organizational level, the idea that everything is fixable. And that notion actually leads to 2 other myths that we identified, one of which is only perfection is acceptable, and there's only one way in which to attain that perfection. And our view is that it's these constraints of managerial thinking that go some way to explain the dominant and negative influence of the consulting industry, which is so ably outlined in a new book by Matsukato and Collington called The Big Cotton. So not thinking, not really listening, just acting tends to be the way in which things happen in many corporate settings. Now, the clash at the heart of the practice for the person whom I'm speaking, the consultant, someone who in their role is expected to be seen to be listening to people at the sharp end of the organisation, but all the time exclusively focused on that fixability and the importation of ready-made solutions, meant that in each situation, the workforce was being invited to share their voice because the consultant was there to listen, and there was a semblance of listening because that consultant was taking notes on the laptop, but those voices were not actually being heard. And the consultant then got into a slightly deeper level and talked of their personal frustration about having to listen to those voices. They saw their role as a fixer, and they had no real interest in what was being said. And again, that's something you can often see with leadership in corporate settings. A lot of attention, invitation to voice, apparent listening, but little sense of things being heard. In fact, he went on to say how irritating he found it to have to listen to people like this, and also that a lot of the time he felt I was hearing the same thing over and over again. He was at a loss to understand why people might be repeating themselves to him, even as I gently suggested that possibly they were saying the same things again and again because they did not feel that they had been heard. And just recently, I came across an interesting research paper by Chris Kluger and Liddy, which was published in Frontiers of Psychology back in 2021. Their research very clearly indicated that three circumstances left people feeling unheard. Firstly, shutting down by the listener. Just saying, yes, I haven't got time to listen to this. I'm really busy. I'm just going to stop you from talking. Secondly, superficial listening. So the sort of listening a consultant would have been engaged in. And thirdly, distracted listening. Yeah, no, I hear. I've just got to do this. So those three things are quite powerfully indicative of people not being heard. In contrast, the authors of that article argue to feel heard, those giving voice have to perceive an openness on the part of the listener, and crucially, that this listening translates into action of some sort in response to the needs being articulated by the speaker. So the argument is just listening isn't enough. One needs to be seen to do something in light of what is heard. It's an acknowledgement of what has been heard. Overall, this reminds us perhaps we should stop defining ourselves in terms of position and start to think of reconnecting ourselves as a human agent with other people around us to connect in that way. To undertake that transition, we need to be aware of hierarchy and power, which can on occasion be two separate things for us to consider, but sometimes come together. And those two things, hierarchy and power, particularly in corporate settings, clog our ears and fog our mind, and stop us from engaging in the world as a human agent. The consultant's final complaint was a lot of what he felt he had to listen to seemed to him to be just moaning. It's just people moaning. And that it seemed as though they often repeated themselves and were expecting him to offer solutions. And it might be that they perhaps perceived him as a fixer that he imagines himself to be, but didn't realise that his fixes are tailored to the needs of the person paying his bills and not to the collective good. The dispiriting experience of being prompted to speak, to hear one's voice in a corporate space, only to find that nothing happens in response to that, seems certain to drive down the mood of a speaker. Unsurprisingly, the consultant saw himself as effective, and in those terms, as someone doing good in the world. But he made the mistake of misunderstanding what people were saying to him and why they were motivated to say it, which served to deny their voices. In fact, to silence them, despite the fact they were being seen to speak out. This error, to my mind, was compounded by a crude flattening of human experience, where the assumption arises that everyone is repeatedly saying the same thing. All day, they just keep saying the same thing to me. Everyone says the same thing. Corporate life, unfortunately, and helpfully sometimes aggregates the richness of human experience to a mere array of numbers. But a similar flattening occurs when we assume that everyone seems to be saying the same thing, which leads us to not properly hear what each individual is saying in light of the fact that everyone's experience is different and specific to them. They may say the same thing, or it may look like the same text, but the motivation for them to say that is different in each and every case. So the act of hearing a person is actually to acknowledge their experience. And that leads me to just my concluding remark, which is, for John and I, the critical thing that comes out of the book, and it's all saved, it happened to read it, hopefully, only by listening to hear and hearing so as to understand, do we create space around us for people to enter into meaningful dialogue with us. And that's a message that ultimately the consultant with whom I was speaking was completely unable to hear. Thank you. I think I may have run over my time. I'm sorry, David. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to slightly different mood to sort of paint another part of the picture that we covered in the book. And it goes back to David presenting the Speak Up book, which I earlier was involved in. And it is this whole thing that in the cliche that silence and speaking up are all part of a dance. And they're two sides of the same coin. And particularly in corporate settings, the focus is on the speaking up and people finding their voice. And we don't take the silence seriously. I'm just actually going to read the first sort of sentence that we came up for the book, which says, silence always has something to say. It's never neutral and speaks volumes if people are willing to hear. Our response to silence is often to dismiss or end it, to block it out with noise. Instead, silence needs to be taken seriously. And it's once you start paying attention to it, it obviously is all around us. I mean, I'm very conscious now that there are, 34 other people who are, in terms of silence, in terms of the public arena, are being silent. But I am certain that you are all having an internal conversation. You are not silent internally. And again, it's that being very conscious of that. And this is where the challenges of this technology is that I am not getting the cues that I could otherwise read. But then again, even if I'm in a social setting, in a one-to-one setting, most of what I'm reading into the silence is my projection. It is my anxieties. It is my own self-belief as to whether, of course, the world wants to hear me and is delighted to be silent while I hold forth. And it is this idea, therefore, that there's a huge requirement for speakers and for people who have the opportunity not to be silenced, to be extremely attentive to what is going on for people around them and to be aware of what personal need is being met when they are silencing others or filling the space. Because the whole point is that if I am speaking, somebody else isn't. There is always a silent shadow being cast by my speaking. And I'm sort of looking at my notes, and a couple of areas specifically around this silent shadow. And one of the big ones is the difference between what is espoused and what is actually experienced. And one of the big ones on that is, I'm reminded of somebody I spoke to who, during one of the rounds of a complex corporate restructuring, there was a Zoom conversation, there was a presentation by the great and the good, and they invited comments to be made in the chat. So the comments went in, and this particular person entered a comment, and the moderator intervened and fed back to this person that the comment they had made was against the corporate values. So again, and this is not unusual to hear particularly senior leaders say that, well, in our organization, these are our values, which tend to be abstract, generic, basic statements of general motherhood and apple pie, which therefore provide a way of policing out stickier, smellier, more human experiences or expressions that don't fit the norm. Another piece of this silence shadow is around charged topics. So in the breakout that we just had when we were in our pairs, I was chatting to Leslie, who comes from South China on the borders with Hong Kong. And I felt extremely nervous. And I shared it with her, was that I had lived in Hong Kong when my father was in the military, the fag end of the British Empire. And I felt, why did I raise this? I mean, I'm still even saying it here. I'm a bit anxious about what was going on between those sorts of comments, those sorts of life experiences which we feel uncomfortable sharing. Less relevant, less specific to the situation am I what you share and don't share when you're meeting somebody where you're thinking, my cultural history has a somewhat complicated relationship with your cultural history, is I do a lot of work with someone called Barbara Banda, who is a Black British professional. And in case you can't see me, I'm a very white British professional. And I come very much, my accent and everything is I come from the British establishment. And, when I was interviewing Barbara, and again, it was quite a novel experience for me. It was in a largely Black audience, so I'm in a minority. And in most of the European and American settings I am in the dominant ethnic group. And I asked Barbara, how did she feel about being interviewed by a white establishment British man? And she spoke very openly about how it's evoked feelings of being examined, almost took her back into feelings of being stripped, and of almost, it had a sort of a slave history quality to it. She then flipped it round to me, and we had rehearsed this and we'd agreed I was going to do this, but I still found it very difficult when she asked me, what does it feel like to interview a Black woman as a white man in public? And what I shared with her was suddenly I was having to pay really close attention to what I said. And it's this, I was having to pay attention to the assumptions, the headwaters of thinking that Mark identified. I was having to pay attention to what otherwise is silenced, which is all the assumptions I make about what makes for an easy social or professional interaction. Suddenly I was having to slow down. I was having to think. I was having to pause, which meant that actually the way I spoke had more quiet in it, which again creates a very different experience. The other thing that I'd like to say about, areas in our professional life that are often silenced is around relationships and intimacy. It's probable in a group like this that, you are a more relationally literate group than many in the corporate environment, where the focus is very strongly on task. And the idea, and again, this is, I suspect, familiar to many of you, is the work of Martin Buber and his notion of the distinction between I, it, and I, thou relating. And in most professional settings, we privilege I, it relating, which is treating other people as instruments to achieve a goal, by the collective or personal. We treat each other as things. What gets silenced is how we feel about each other, that the qualities rather than the quantities of our connection. I-thou relating is a very different experience, and that is that experience of deep seeing of the other, of deep connection, of deep valuing of the other in and of themselves. A very different emotional connection. And again, if you're thinking about the old business cliche of we keep the emotion out, well, actually, that is one of the most criminal silencing we can do, because there is nothing as horrible as being in the presence of another human being who is being unemotional with you. And I think when we talked about the idea of being silent together in a group, it's often we experience that. It's like meeting the mask. If all we get is the silence, it's then we project all our worst fears, all our assumptions onto the other. So that comes into this whole thing that silence is never neutral. We come up with the categories of 7. I'm not going to list them now, but the whole point is that silence can be imposed, it can be invited, it can be policed, it can often actually just be chosen. And this is, again, what is often misunderstood is that it's for the people who are least powerful in a setting formally, staying silent is how they exercise power. If in this, why don't you speak up? Well, I don't speak up because the only way I can find my agency, find my ability to influence the world is by staying silent. And it may be a destructive agency, but it's the only thing that's open to me. The other thing on the silence that reminds me, and I only came across this yesterday, is it's this fixation with the quantification, with measurement. And things that can't be measured and quantified don't count as real. And there is a particular institution here in the UK that recently had a massive ethical problem. It was done for harassment, about everything going. It was a sex discrimination of the foulest kind. And their first act is to bring in something called the ethical index. They are going to measure the quality of the ethics of the organization, which I find intellectually bankrupt. When you think, so we're going to take Plato, we're going to take Aristotle, we're going to take Socrates, and we're going to turn it into a sliding 5-scale number. You know, what are my ethics? They're 3 out of 5. What on earth does that say? But again, it's this, if you can't turn something into a number, it's not real. I'm just going to skip on for a little bit here, because I'm aware of sort of in terms of the time. And it's going to link to the thing that Mark was talking about, that when we did the interviews for the sort of the book, we had these 35 free format stories. And it's a story against ourselves. It's that the reason we collected these 35 stories started off by a desire to collect some numbers about how people experience silence. And we got actually way more than 35. And when we first got the answers, we said, well, we better turn it into some numbers because that's some face validity and it helps shift the units on the books and gets you into the magazines. But what we then became interested in was when we attended to the 35 people who had written in, often quite extensively, free format about their experience of being silenced and silencing others. And what really stood out was how unique each experience was. And actually what really stood out was how much, particularly me to start with, wanted to edit out the people whose opinions I didn't like. There was one person who wanted to complain, you know, I am a white middle-aged British man, and I feel discriminated against because everybody else, every minority group, all the women and all the people of color are getting privileged over me. And I wanted to edit this person out. I wasn't going to put their story in my book until we said, hang on, you know, part of the problem for that person is that they were feeling marginalized thing. They might come from a majority group, but if there was an unpopular experience that needed to be treated reasonably. And again, it's this, the more important thing is to notice how we want to edit out experiences that make us feel uncomfortable. We want to silence others. And I found that working alongside Mark was incredibly useful and powerful because he helped notice me when I was doing that. And so often it's so hard to notice when our emotion, our heart is up and we are being disturbed, that our capacity to sit back and be a really disciplined hearer goes. And we actually require somebody else around us to help us do that. So I'm going to finish with one sentence that is my COD description, my sort of, you know, boil this all down, give us a, you know, what's the one thing we can do based upon the book? And it's if you don't listen to people on their own terms, you're silencing them. And we need to learn to interpret silence as rigorously as we do voice. David.
John, Mark, huge thank you for that introduction. And I guess so much of it is, it's way more complex, isn't it? and way more nuanced than just encouraging people to speak up. I guess that says a lot about human existence. But anyway, what we're going to do now, we're going to go into conversation. We're going to have 3 rounds of conversation, 10 to 15 minutes each in breakout rooms. So those of you who are not familiar with the cafe, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. That's going to be about 3, maybe 4 people per room.